Welcome back to the PFC podcast. The views and opinions you are about to hear are the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of anyone else. Now on to the podcast.
Welcome back to the PFC podcast. This is Dennis, and today I'm with Brett. How are you doing today?
Doing well. How about yourself?
Doing well. So, as tradition has it, if you wouldn't mind just doing a real quick introduction of yourself?
Yep. My name is Brett. I am a paramedic on Paso County Search and Rescue. We're one of the busiest mountain rescue teams in the country. I was a Army medic for many years. I was lucky enough to go to the Expeditionary Combat Medic course, which was a short-lived course, but we were supposed to be experts in prolonged field care. Then I switched over to the side, got deployed as a flight medic. Now back home, working part-time ambulance side, kind of on a rural ambulance, doing long kind of transport times in the middle of the woods of Colorado, and obviously still on my search and rescue team.
Nice. So, which is exactly why I asked you to come on, just from your experience working in the mountains. So, obviously, in whether it's military or civilian, there are dedicated mountain teams, but often, when you're a wilderness or austere medical provider, you're asked to go to different places that maybe you have experience and maybe you don't. So I'd like to really lean on that experience in the mountains and kind of give a background, bit of information to the listeners. So kind of the first question is, what makes the mountainous environment, really different, right? Every environment has its unique things, and other than gravity, what makes working in the mountains difficult?
Yeah, that's a good question. Just so the listeners know where I function, we are a population base of 600,000 people next to a 14,000 foot mountain. And people can see that from downtown Colorado Springs, and, I can just hike up it in a day. It's actually like 13 miles and 8,000 vertical feet. So that's the deceptive nature of a lot of the mountains, I think, is really interesting, because down here today, it's in the mid 80s. I was on the summit of Pikes Peak yesterday morning, and it was 39 degrees. And that's summertime. And I find that the terrain variability is really difficult for a lot of people, because the planning of, hey, I need to have wintertime clothes in July is no kidding up there. And these are relatively small mountains by big mountain Himalaya standards, right? But we have a huge population base that, I can drive to the top of a mountain, or I have the access to 911, and they don't realize mountains are not something to be messing around with.
Okay. So, people just kind of overestimating their abilities, right? Mm-hmm. They don't prepare. Classic, just wilderness rescue type situation, overly confident, underprepared, and, Murphy just jumps in your little knapsack with you, right?
Yep.
So, what are just some basic skills, when you got to this environment and you became part of this, mountain rescue team? What were just some basic things that you discovered, or hopefully were taught before you discovered them, that you needed to function properly?
So that's a really good question. So I grew up in the mountains of Colorado, obviously, like almost 10,000 feet. I climbed Rainier when I was 15. I did Denali on a private team like 6 years ago. And I was able to I was a rock jock. I've always been a rock jock, a climber. Got on the STAR team, and there was very little that transferred over, because that environment is a completely different thing. I enjoy sport climbing, trad climbing, whatever. We don't really do that in search and rescue. The thing that I find that has the biggest impact on people's ability to operate comfortably in the woods is knowing their gear, knowing what works for them, and the ability to be uncomfortable. So I was a kid, like my parents would make fun of me, but I literally would set up my tent when I was 13 years old in the snow outside their house. They thought I was crazy, right? But I knew how to operate in the wintertime at that point. I know I was probably dropped on my head too many times, but it was a very kind of interesting experience, because what I usually tell people is, if you can make your life in the mountains 5 or 10% more comfortable, whether that be on a multi-day, multi-month expedition, on a search and rescue mission that's 20 hours long, if you can take 3 or 5% and make yourself more comfortable, that'll add up at the end of the day to your ability to actually successfully rescue somebody or yourself.
Okay. So you talk about comfort. I mean, ounces or pounds, right? So, I'm bringing, a 4-season tent, giant sleeping bag, pads, about, 400 yards into this walk, I'm going to regret every bit of those things.
Yep. Yeah, I think I have a difficult time blending that comfort and the hardship factor, and I've dealt with that a lot. Like when we did Denali, my pack and sled were 110 pounds, but that pillow. So when I talk about that 3 or 5%, my little inflatable pillow allowed me to sleep much better. Therefore, I had more energy. So you have to personally weigh like what this is, and especially with medics, they're always like, "Oh, just carry this one other light thing. Carry this one other light thing. Or what if I need an eye gel? What if I need this?" That will end up really weighing you down at the end of the day.
Yeah. So, when it comes to, since this is a medical podcast, let's talk about medicine, right? But where do you draw that line between my gear and the medical gear for a situation, a patient that you just know you have a patient in the mountains?
Yep. And that's a really hard thing to determine. And we're lucky enough here. We work very closely with dispatch. We have some very good on-duty coordinators, and there's a lot of very good SAR teams around the state and country that have very good working relationships. And as we know on the medical side, the dispatch information may not always be right. And typically in the backcountry, honestly, I don't carry that much stuff, because by the time I get to somebody, if they're 3 or 4 hours out in the backcountry, they're going to be alive stable or dead stable. Because if someone needed a tourniquet for a massive hemorrhage, 4 hours, they're not going to be around. Right. And so I really don't carry that much stuff. I don't carry that many medications, just because logistically, imagine doing an IV when it's 7 below at 14,000 feet and it's windy. It's not practical to do that. And a lot of good medicine is good BLS in the backcountry.
Okay. So what kind of gear do you bring?
So I have a little tiny Condor pack, like slightly bigger than an IFAC, essentially. I have a cric kit in there. I have Epi, because that's one of those things that has a bunch of uses in it. Sam Splint, because the majority of our calls are the bottom 3 miles of Pikes Peak, and somebody slips and breaks an ankle. That's the majority of what we do in the summertime. Space blanket, typical kind of combat gauze, tourniquets, and then chest seals, and I carry something to do finger Thors or NCDs. Okay. Because really, there's just not a lot we're going to be able to do. Right.
No, that makes sense. And I'm guessing you're probably heavy on the hypothermia type stuff.
Yeah, because that's where I met Dr. Keenan originally. He was actually on our SAR team originally, and that's where I met him. And he's very famous for saying, right, the 2 things you can't add in is heat and blood easily back into a patient. And we are very good at the hypothermia side, because I've come across many patients at 13 or 14,000 feet that are not wearing enough and they're frozen, and you got to get calories back into them. That's the biggest key. And then you're going to rewarm them. I usually carry, if it's somebody from sea level where I know it's going to be one of these, I'll carry an oxygen tank. We have carbon fiber oxygen tanks, set it on maybe 1 or 2 liters nasal cannula, and they'll end up walking faster than you after that, because they're on oxygen at 14,000 and you're not.
Right. Right. So, you had mentioned, austere medicine versus wilderness medicine. I guess, what is the difference?
So I really like the woofers and wilderness EMTs. I think that's a really good program and a very good course for us. It is austere medicine, and kind of what we always talk about in prolonged field care is it's being somewhere where you want to be with a patient that you shouldn't be on. Know these things, and you have some gear. It's not like I have a stick and a t-shirt. I have some gear. I do have stuff with me. You've got to be more creative. And that's your austere medicine, whether that be in a hotel room, whether that be at a hospital and during Hurricane Katrina when it floods and power goes out, or the side of a 14,000 foot mountain. I have gear, I have knowledge, but I find myself in that austere medicine kind of arena.
Yeah. And just like in the last podcast, we went over some improvised medicine things. Having that knowledge of being able to improvise and overcome the situation can be invaluable. But definitely you should pack for those situations so you're not improvising. Like, it's not an excuse to just carry a lighter pack. I'll improvise it, right? You should definitely have the gear you have or need. But if you find yourself without, having the knowledge to be able to improvise, definitely invaluable. So, like, you have teams, or whether that be, teams that are inexperienced and they're volunteering to come out west to help fight fires, or just people that are not used, they're used to the job, they're not used to the environment. Compare that team to maybe somebody who is used to that environment. Like, where do the newbies, where do they screw up?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We have the wildland teams, they have REMs now. They're rapid extraction modules, what they're called, because we all know wildfires are getting bigger. These guys are in really remote locations, and they can be from wherever, right? And that poses a really tough challenge, especially when we're dealing with people that don't understand the environment, because it's hot here today, right? It's hot here in a lot of spots. But again, like we were talking earlier, it can be really cold. Tomorrow, I think Sunday here is supposed to be in like the 50s. And you have to know your gear. And I preach this is you have to know your stuff and have to know your gear and what works. I was at the Mountain Warfare School in Vermont. I'm a big time climber, right? I did Denali. I got to Vermont and I froze my ass off because I'm not used to the humidity there. And the gear that works for me here in Colorado, which I've done many times, did not work in Vermont. I was there in January and I was like, wow, I feel like a complete noob, like you said. Or somebody coming into this environment. And it's tough. It's easy to say, pre-plan, go out a couple days early, kind of figure out what's going to work for you. It's very easy to say that and much harder to actually do that.
Right. So, other than just gear, other than just being in shape, like, when I imagine mountain rescue, I imagine like scaling a vertical cliff with my ice axes, right? Ropes, like 5 miles of rope on me. Is that realistic? I mean, is that the majority of the environment?
Yeah, this is the cliffhanger syndrome, right?
Right.
So in reality, as I mentioned earlier, the majority of our calls in the summertime is somebody broken ankle on the bottom third peak. We have the incline here. That goes up 2,100 vertical feet and 1.1 miles. And it's obviously very steep. It's a huge tourist attraction. The problem is somebody comes from sea level. They've been drinking all night, aren't hydrating enough because, again, sea level, and then they decide to do the incline, and they pass out, and everybody freaks out. And, what we usually will do is we'll go up, coach drinking, right? We all know oral rehydration is really important. If somebody obviously has an airway and the ability to protect it, we'll do that. A lot of it's just helping people. Like, we know a broken ankle in July on the side of Pikes Peak is not going to kill anybody, but that person has never been so scared of their life. And it's our job to go up there, put them in a litter. It's basically a Stokes basket with a mountain bike tire that bolts to the bottom, and we take people down the mountain that way. We do have the cliffhanger scenarios like you're talking about. Typically, and I'll never say never, right? In medicine, we try never to climb up to somebody. I always try and rappel down to somebody, because there's some very, very, very good technical, YOSAR teams that do the climbing side very well. There's a couple of us in our SAR team that do that. From a safety standpoint, I'd much rather put an anchor up top and rappel down to my patient. That is just a much safer way of doing it. But unfortunately, the mountains dictate what they do, and you can't always do that. The climbing aspect is fairly rare. The rope work aspect, and I mentioned this earlier about the deliberate rescue versus hasty. We carry a lot of stuff. We have big systems kits that we can create 3-to-1 uphaul systems. We can lower somebody in that Stokes basket, whatever that's going to look like to keep our people safe. and the subjects. And we've had away that a couple of times and called off missions, mostly for body recoveries, because it just wasn't safe for us to go pick up a body at that point.
Okay. So, if I have a truncated period of time to prepare, is it worth it for me to spend my time learning, these high speed, high angle rescue type things, or put my effort more towards something else?
Yeah, I very much agree. It's worth putting time somewhere else. People, I think, underestimate the value of getting somebody up a hill, or if somebody's in a ditch, right? Learning how to do a hasty rescue system with not a lot of gear is a really valuable tool for anybody that's going to play. Even if you're in the Midwest where you don't have big mountains, you have these drainage ditches, you have all types of stuff that people can fall into. And being able to get them up and out and getting yourself down into it is probably pretty valuable. And you don't need that much gear, and you don't need that much high angle experience to be able to do those things.
Okay. Any other things that I need to focus on?
Yeah. So I think, for somebody that's in the medicine world will be seeing this, I think understanding how to do 3-to-1 up-haul systems with progress capture is really important, because one person or two people trying to get one person up a hill is exhausting. And one thing that kind of became very apparent to me early on in my SAR career was by the time you get to your patient, you need to have a lot of gas left, because that's when the work happens. So if they're 4 or 5 or 8 hours out and you're gassed by the time you get to them, you're not going to do any good for them medically or from a transport standpoint. So in understanding how you're, and especially, you guys in the SF world do a really good job of like, hey, I know I can go this far. I've done this. I understand this. I can operate under this kind of environment. But then you have to throw the complexity of a rescue scenario into it. So the 3-to-1 up-haul, I think, is really important. Knowing how to lower somebody or a team without a lot of gear is important, and some kind of anchor building ability, whether that's around a tree, a car. That's a really, really good thing to know. And even in a building like what we're seeing in Ukraine, right? You have to extract out of a building really quickly. How do you do that safely and effectively without a lot of gear?
Right. I guess what would you recommend? Where would you recommend? East Coast, West Coast, getting this type of training? Is there like a certification or something like that people need to look for?
So that's tough. There's not a really big regulatory body. There's one major one called the Mountain Rescue Association, and basically we are part of the Mountain Rescue Association, our team, and we get recertified every 5 years by a jury of our peers, essentially. And it's a very in-depth, difficult process. And you also have a subset of rescue levels in there. Support level, rescue level, field team leader. This is for dedicated rescue people. Outside of that, there are definitely like sport climbing leader rescue classes that AMGA, to American Mountain Guide Association, those guys will put on. And the problem is there's not that much like hasty rescue from a team dynamic standpoint. I'm in a small team to try and do stuff. There's just not that much out there. There's much more so on the American Mountain Guide Association, and those guys do a really good job with that. They're single pitch rock rescue or rock instructor, and they do a very good job with that. And especially for the guide space, because they will see that. They'll have somebody, we call it geckoed out on the rock, where they get scared and they look like a gecko on the rock. Yeah. They'll need to get rescued. And that's probably the closest you'll find to something like that, to kind of be between those two gaps of the mountain rescue professional, the professional mountain guide, and the climbing, people that are out sport climbing.
Okay. Just kind of rehashing some stuff. Preparing my gear, we talked about comfort. I guess, we talked about some of the medical gear, trying to minimize it, keeping it light. Obviously, you're bringing your food and water. Obviously, you have to have some kind of communication ability of some sort. But what kind of, hypothermia, like how do you build your hypothermia kits?
Yeah. I'm going to back up to what you said about comms, because I think the civilian world does that poorly. We rely on cell phones. We have VHF radios, or the 800 trunking radios from Motorola. Most a lot of the SAR teams I know now are carrying Garmin inReaches or some kind of satellite-based communication. You have to have a pace plan, because most mountain rescue teams, their primary job is not the medicine. And so I preach to my team all the time, telemed consult. And we just had this the other day of a televet consult, because we rescue dogs, and we had the people on the rescue had some questions about dosing medication, pain management for a dog. And that is such a hugely beneficial tool that I always try and preach. To have your pace plan for sure for the comm side, because everybody thinks, oh, I'm just going to call. I just got my cell phone. It's like, no, it's the mountains. Right. And as far as the hypothermia side, a lot of people have this misnomer that the space blanket's going to save you. It's not. The little Mylar thing is not going to, but it's a great vapor barrier. And like you said, you have to have options, and you have one thing that does multiple tools. And so from the hasty rescue side, I really like using my Mylar space blanket as my vapor barrier, and then I'll put warming layers on top of them. So this way they don't, in theory, hopefully don't get the warming layers too wet, and that vapor barrier will definitely keep them warmer. What I've seen that's really effective on the deliberate rescue side is we have full-length vacuum mattresses, body vacuum mattresses, and there's a special SARS-ish sleeping bag system called a Wiggies. The full-length vacuum mattress inside the Wiggies, people are usually pretty good. And if they need it, we'll use some kind of active rewarming in the form of chemical heat packs, typically.
Okay. Have you found that they work well at altitude, or at least the altitude you're normally working in?
Yeah. So ready heats are not great up here. So the air activated ones are almost worthless. We use 2 chemical ones. So there's no air involved. It's 2 liquid chemical reactions. And we went through a lot of this testing. We have a lot of really smart engineers on the team. They went, nope, air activated ones are crap. Let's use the liquid chemical ones, and they work much better.
Who makes those?
I honestly don't know. I have to look to see who makes them. There's 2 different companies that we've used throughout the years. Part of something to kind of keep in the back of your mind is, well, I'm going to go do this. I leave these chemical heaters in my backpack. They can pop, they can rupture, right? And so it's these like 3 or 5% mistakes that you can make that really make a big outcome difference for your patient. Because, oh, wow, I didn't realize these had exploded in the back of my bag because they've been there for 3 years. And now I have no way of actively rewarming your patient.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that just like any professional, right? You check your gear before you depend on it, right? And like you meant, the Wiggies bag. I've heard of a few others that work just far better than the HPMK and the Ready Heat combo. And when if you were to look at the studies where they were evaluating those things, the only benefit to the HPMK and the Ready Heat is it was small. It didn't actually help at all with hypothermia, which is kind of the intent, right? But it was green and it was small, so the Army bought it. So, but yeah, if you're serious, their hypothermia is a real potential for your patient, which all patients have a potential of being hypothermic, especially if trauma patients. Get gear that actually works. It's big. Usually they're pretty big. You can probably collapse it down if you get creative and vacuum seals and et cetera, and just play with it. But it's going to be big. Just suck it up and prepare for that. But hypothermia, a huge problem, not just in cold environments, but really any type of environment.
Yep. We have the Ascent Marathon up Pikes Peak. It's actually next weekend, I believe. Many years ago, we had a big hailstorm come up on the summit of Pikes Peak, and we had hundreds of racers get hypothermic, right? These guys are wearing little, running shorts and little running vests, and it's 35 degrees and hailing. And there's your mass casualty event where everybody's like, wow. And thankfully, we have enough smart people on the team, and we took care of it. And we didn't have a single injury up there. We got really, really well prepared for that because we have some very smart people that do that. But that's one of those instances of like, holy crap, like this is now a really serious, massive casualty incident that a lot of people could have died up there. And we were well prepared, thankfully.
You had mentioned weather, like in the mountains, never lived in the mountains, any real mountains anyway. How fast can the weather change?
Yeah, it's instantaneous. The other thing that's really interesting about very mountainous regions is all the microclimates. One side of a mountain versus the other, one aspect of the other mountain can be completely different. And, I remember growing up here, snow in July is not that uncommon. It's pretty wild to be able to deal with that kind of stuff here. And being able to forecast that is really difficult. The other thing, as far as the weather goes in Colorado, is we have a ton of avalanches because of the weather we have and the sunlight we have. That unfortunately kills a lot of backcountry skiers typically in the wintertime. From the rescue side, there's a lot of stuff to think about with that. And I tell people good medicine is not always about the medicine, because you got to keep yourself safe and get your patient out of the scenario there and wherever it may be safely. So if I'm going to go across a snow slope that's, unstable slab, get myself in an avalanche, I've now turned one victim into a whole bunch of victims. So the good medicine is just not always about the medicine.
Right. So you also have a training course. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so actually 4 of us on the search and rescue team started a training company because kind of just talking about is if someone needs a rescue, right, in theory they're hurt. So we need to combine a rope rescue with medicine, with austere medicine or whatever that would look like. And I have found that a lot of teams, because we work with governments, we work with individuals, and a lot of teams don't train interdisciplinary. Obviously, you guys on the ODAs do that really well, and that's kind of a relatively similar model we take, is everybody needs to understand parts of the medicine, right? Everybody has to understand how to check the system to make sure the system's safe. Anybody can look at the system and go, yep, that's safe, or nope, that's not safe. Even if they're a paramedic or not, it doesn't matter. And so I really hammer interdisciplinary training, because if you're not going to be good at all that craft, somebody's going to get hurt or your patient's going to suffer.
Mm-hmm. So what's the name of your company? How do we reach out to you?
So we're called Anyone Not Ready. That actually, again, comes from the search and rescue world. And anyoneNotReady.com. We have a whole bunch of unique kind of courses. We also license the austere emergency care course that Dr. Keenan kind of put together and Ragged Edge does. I helped build part of the BLS class as well, because I really feel very strongly about putting out austere medicine, because my transport can be 2 or 3 hours. And I think it's really important that people get into the mindset of prolonged field care or austere care, because a lot of these people have the skills. They need to change their mindset and go, wow, I can use IV tubing for these 5 different things. I didn't even realize this. So I think that's a really important thing.
Okay. What type of courses do you have other than ropes and things like that?
So we do we have 4 kind of pillars of the company, and we talk about leadership, tactical, rope rescue, and medicine. And where it's appropriate, we combine them. I was doing a big exercise with some SWAT teams, and kind of standard story. Somebody went down to go treat a patient. M4 came unslung from his shoulder, smacked somebody in the face. So now we have a bleeding leg and an airway problem, right? So where it's appropriate, we try and combine and have people have the awareness of what they need to do. So anything within those buckets we'll teach. And thankfully, we have a very deep pool of instructors that are very good. I feel very lucky to have those people in my life.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Brett. I really appreciate it.
That's it for today's podcast. Be sure to go to our website, www.prolongedfieldcare.org. Find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. Subscribe and stay on the bleeding edge of combat medicine. This is Dennis for the PFC Podcast. Out.
Boy, it's waiting there for you.